He sat in the snow, invisible to everyone, until she crossed the street. But why would a woman with nothing left offer kindness to a stranger? And how did that one act uncover years of injustice buried by silence? "Why help me when you have so little?" he asked. She smiled, because no one should be alone on Christmas. What happened next will change how you see strangers forever. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe too. The snow had already blanketed Chicago in white by the time Janelle Brooks stepped outside her building, boots crunching over a sidewalk that hadn't seen salt in days. Christmas morning offered no miracles, just another brutal wind slicing down from the lake, curling around her thin coat like it wanted inside her bones. Her gloves didn't match. One had a tear across the palm, but her hands were clasped, fingers curled together as she made her way to St. Augustine Chapel, a few blocks and one final shred of warmth away. She didn't come to ask for anything, not food, not money, not even a way out. She came because sometimes, when everything else was uncertain, the quiet of a chapel could hold space for hope, a hope she couldn't afford to speak aloud. Inside, flickering candles lined the wooden altar, their orange glow reflected in stained glass windows dusted with frost. Janelle knelt at the back pew, her breath rising in soft white clouds. She didn't pray for herself. She whispered for those whose pain didn't even make the news, for families stuck in shelters, for elders forgotten in care homes, for people like her who still believed the world could be softer. When she finally stepped out into the white silence again, the wind slapped her back into the now. And then she saw him. Across the street, by the locked gate of a subway entrance buried in snow, sat an elderly man, maybe mid-70s, hunched, his coat thin and threadbare. His hands trembled as he tried to pull the collar closer to his neck. Passers-by didn't slow down. Some glanced. Most didn't. Janelle didn't think. Her boots turned automatically. She ducked into the corner store down the block, the heat inside fogging her glasses. She counted her money, just under $12. It was supposed to stretch until Tuesday. She bought a cup of hot tea, a bag of raisin pastries, and a plain gray scarf from a clearance rack. Nothing fancy. Everything is warm. She crossed back, slow and deliberate. He looked up as she handed him the cup. "You didn't have to," he rasped. Janelle just smiled, pressing the scarf gently into his lap. "It's Christmas," she said. "You shouldn't be alone." She turned to leave. She didn't know his name, didn't know he would change her life, and didn't know he had already decided to change hers. Janelle Brooks used to wear pressed blazers and flats that clicked confidently across marble floors. She used to drink lukewarm office coffee in beige paper cups and sort emails with color-coded urgency levels. She used to believe that hard work eventually paid off. That was before the email. She hadn't meant to stir the waters, only to name the storm. One quiet afternoon, her fingers had hovered over the keyboard before finally sending a message to HR. She'd laid it out gently, respectfully, how black staff were routinely passed over, how hours stretched unpaid, how silence felt expected and dangerous. No one replied. 2 weeks later, her workload doubled. Her meetings disappeared from the calendar. A month after that, her ID badge didn't scan at the front door. No formal firing. No explanation. Just a quiet erasure. She now lived in a creaky studio apartment above a pawn shop in South Side Chicago. The radiator hissed more than it heated, and the single-pane windows did nothing to block the cold. She lined the floorboards with old towels to keep the draft out. There was no routine anymore. On some days, she washed dishes in a dim back room of a soul food diner. On others, she babysat for a neighbor who paid her in cash and leftovers. And on the best days, she wrote odd freelance blog posts for next to nothing, articles about things like top 5 winter coats under $30, a list she never used for herself. Her fridge rattled more than it hummed. Her phone paid off barely. Her dignity came and went, like the hot water in the shower. But her kindness, that never left. Even when exhaustion clung to her shoulders like a soaked coat, Janelle still offered her seat on the bus, still smiled at neighbors, still whispered, "Take care," to the mail carrier delivering past due notices. Some part of her refused to let the world harden her. Not because she was naive, but because the only thing more painful than being discarded was becoming the kind of person who forgot what it felt like. Janelle was 10 the day it happened. They had just finished her mother's second shift of the day, cleaning the night floors of a downtown medical office, and her mother had promised her a small treat. Nothing fancy, just a sit-down meal at a diner with shiny booths and bottomless syrup. Janelle remembered being excited. She wore her best shoes, the ones with the little gold buckle. Her mother had even swiped on lipstick in the car, a deep maroon that made her look tired but determined. But when they stepped through the diner doors, something shifted. The hostess, a young, white, tight smile, looked them over for half a second too long. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice syrupy but flat. "We have a dress code after 5. No work uniforms allowed." Janelle had blinked. She looked at her mother's outfit. It was clean, neat. A simple collared shirt and slacks, the same thing she wore to both of her cleaning jobs. Behind them, a white man in cargo shorts and a hoodie walked in. The hostess waved him right through. Janelle's small hand gripped her mother's fingers tighter. Her mother didn't argue, didn't shout. She simply turned, guiding her daughter back out into the cold. They sat in the car, parked beneath the glow of a flickering street lamp. Neither of them touched the granola bars her mother pulled from her bag, and then her mother spoke, voice quiet, eyes forward. "People will always find a reason to turn you away, baby. Skin, clothes, accent, it doesn't matter. But don't let them teach you shame." Janelle swallowed hard, blinking up at her mother's profile. "You don't need money to do what's right," she added. "Only the guts to do it even when it costs you." That line stuck. It is rooted in her like marrow. In every moment since every rejection, every indignity, Janelle had carried it not as a burden but as a map. A guide. A small truth etched into her: you do what's right, even when no one's watching. Especially then. "I can't let you sit here," Janelle said, her voice firm but kind. "The storm's only getting worse." The old man blinked up at her from beneath his knit cap, flakes of snow clinging to his lashes. He looked like he hadn't stood in hours, like the weight of the cold had folded him in on himself. He didn't move. "I don't want to be a burden," he muttered. "You're not," Janelle replied. "You're a person." He stared at her for a moment longer, searching for hesitation in her eyes. When he found none, he slowly pushed himself to his feet, still clutching the cup of tea she'd handed him minutes earlier. Her apartment wasn't far, but the walk was slow. The snow came sideways now, wind screaming between buildings like a warning. Janelle walked beside him the whole way, her arm lightly brushing his in case he faltered. By the time they stepped into her building, her cheeks burned from the cold and her fingers had gone numb. She didn't apologize for the dim hallway or the draft seeping in from the stairwell. She just unlocked the door and waved him in. "It's not much," she said, tugging off her wet gloves, "but it's warm enough." The radiator rattled like it was coughing up heat in protest. She offered him the armchair near the small fake tree in the corner. Its dollar store lights blinked unevenly. Janelle moved to the kitchen without ceremony. She heated a can of lentil soup, sliced the last of her bread, poured more tea from her old kettle. When she returned with a tray, he hadn't taken off his coat. He just sat, eyes slowly scanning the room. They landed on the pile of envelopes by the windowsill: electric bill, gas bill, final notices. Then the fridge, its hum louder than usual. The taped-up handle, the magnet holding a coupon that had expired last spring. His eyes lingered on her as she set the tray in front of him. "You don't have much," he said quietly. "Why help me?" She didn't answer right away. She sat down across from him, her hands wrapped around her own mug like she needed the warmth to find her voice. "Because no one," she said softly, "should be alone on Christmas." Something in him cracked just a little. His shoulders eased just slightly, and for the first time since they met, he smiled. A real one. The wind outside moaned low and steady, pressing against the windows like a restless spirit. Inside, the room had settled into a quiet so deep, it felt sacred. A single candle burned on the windowsill, its flame swaying gently, casting soft shadows that danced along the walls. The tiny tree in the corner blinked its mismatched lights in no particular rhythm. Preston hadn't touched the soup yet. It sat on the tray, steam fading, forgotten. His hands were wrapped around the tea she'd made, the scarf she'd given him draped across his lap like an afterthought. He was watching her, not with suspicion, not with judgment, something quieter, something deeper. The kind of gaze that comes from a man who's lived long enough to know when someone is real. Janelle felt it, but she didn't flinch under it. She didn't fill the space with chatter or apologies for the chipped mug she held. She didn't explain the stack of bills or the absence of ornaments on the tree. She didn't even ask why he'd been sitting out there alone. Instead, she stood, moved to the stove and poured more hot water into the kettle. She brought it back and refreshed his cup without a word. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was honest. It held pain, maybe, but also respect. Preston nodded once slowly like he had made a decision, like something inside him had just shifted. Still, he said nothing. And Janelle didn't press him. She just sat back down, pulled her knees close to her chest, and stared into the small flame flickering between them. Two strangers, two different storms, holding space for each other in the stillness. The soup had gone cold. Neither of them noticed. The silence, once thick and watchful, softened into something else, something quieter, warmer, like the slow melting of ice. Preston was the first to speak. "She passed in September," he said, voice low. 40 years together. We met when we were both 20. I asked her to dance on a whim. I had no rhythm, still don't." A faint smile tugged at his lips. "She said yes because I looked like I needed a win." Janelle said nothing. She didn't need to. Her eyes stayed on him, steady and kind. "She was the fighter in our family," he continued. "Marched in the 60s. Wrote letters to congressmen well into her 70s. She'd cut you down with a sentence if you stepped out of line, but she had a heart that never ran dry." He paused, voice cracking just a bit. "This was going to be our first Christmas away from the city. Cabin up north. She booked it in June, said we were finally going to have a quiet holiday." He swallowed. "Now every room in that house feels like it's echoing." Janelle leaned forward, her fingers wrapped tight around her mug. "My mom passed 5 years ago," she said gently. "She came to this country with 2 suitcases and a spine of steel, worked cleaning jobs day and night, raised me to speak up even when it cost something." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "She used to say, we don't need to win every fight, but we do have to show up." Preston studied her, his eyes rimmed with something ancient and tender. "My wife would have liked you," he said softly. "Might have even called you the daughter we never had." Janelle didn't reply right away, but something in her face, something just behind her tired eyes, lit up. It wasn't joy exactly, but it was something close. A flicker of belonging. A thread stretching across grief and struggle to say, "You're not alone in this world." They spoke late into the night about small victories, buried regrets, and the strange beauty of holding someone else's pain long enough for it to breathe. When morning came, the snow had slowed. The city felt muffled beneath the fresh weight of it. Preston stood in the doorway, scarf wrapped tight around his neck, tea thermos in hand. He looked back at her one last time. "This won't be our last meeting," he said. And Janelle, standing barefoot on cold linoleum, believed him. 3 days later, an envelope slipped through the crack beneath Janelle's apartment door. Heavy cardstock. Embossed return address. Hill, Torres and Mayer's LLP employment and labor law. She turned it over in her hands, frowning. No stamp, no delivery mark. It hadn't come by mail. Inside was a short note, typed but signed in a firm, elegant scrawl. Come on Tuesday, 10 a.m. Bring nothing but yourself. P.H. Janelle didn't know what to make of it. Maybe someone had referred her for free legal aid. Maybe it was a mistake, but she went. Because curiosity, like hope, had a way of surviving inside her. The law office occupied the entire 7th floor of a glass building downtown. Everything gleamed, marble floors, floor-to-ceiling windows, a wall of framed verdicts and victories. Her thrifted coat felt too loud in the silence of the lobby. A receptionist greeted her warmly and led her into a spacious, wood-paneled conference room. And there, sitting at the head of the table like he belonged, because he did, was Preston Hill. He was in a navy suit now, clean-shaven, sharp-eyed. "Hope you don't mind the invitation," he said with a grin. Janelle blinked. "You work here." "I built this," he replied, 40 years ago. She sank into the chair across from him, speechless. "We're going to fight your case," he said gently. "Every unpaid hour, every lie they told, every door they slammed shut on you." Her voice barely rose above a whisper. "But I can't pay. You're not paying a dime." The weeks that followed were a blur. Preston and his legal team dug deep, recovering internal emails, patterns of racial bias, testimonies from other former employees who'd been too afraid to speak up alone. The case stretched on for months. The company tried to discredit her, offered settlements and whispered threats. Janelle didn't bend, and one cold spring morning, a judge ruled in her favor. She walked out of the courthouse with every penny of her back pay and damages that wiped out every notice on her windowsill. Her name was on the record now. Her story is no longer buried. She was no longer invisible. And for the first time in a long, long while, she walked like she belonged on the sidewalk. 2 weeks after the verdict, Janelle returned to the 7th floor, not as a client but as a guest. Or so she thought. Preston was already waiting in his office, the skyline of Chicago unfolding behind him like a frozen painting. The morning light caught the streaks of silver in his hair, but his presence, steady sure, was as commanding as ever. He gestured toward the chair across from him, a soft smile tugging at the edge of his mouth. "How's it feel?" She took her seat, her coat still dusted with snow. "Like I've been breathing through a straw for years, and suddenly I can fill my lungs." He nodded thoughtfully. "That's what justice feels like when it finally lands." Then he slid a folder across the desk. Her name was typed neatly on the tab. She hesitated, brows knitting. "What's this?" "A job offer," he said simply. "Community advocate, outreach and education, someone who's been in it, not just read about it." She blinked, stunned. "But I'm not a lawyer." Preston leaned forward, folding his hands. "You don't need a degree to fight for people. You need heart. You need grit. You need to know what silence feels like so you recognize it in someone else." He paused, his voice softer now. "And you've got all of that, and then some." The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken meaning. Janelle looked down at the folder, then back up at the man who once sat trembling in the cold with nothing but a scarf and a cup of tea. "I'd be honored," she said. Her new desk sat by the far window, overlooking the city she had once felt so small in. She placed a photo of her mother beside her monitor, her hands strong, her eyes stubborn and proud. Next to it, a handwritten quote on a folded slip of paper: "Kindness isn't weakness. It's the beginning of change." She read it once, then again. And as the snow began to fall softly outside, catching on the edge of the glass, Janelle smiled. Not because everything was perfect, but because for the first time she wasn't surviving anymore. She was building something. And this time she wasn't alone.